So that image there, if we were to actually figure out a distance to shorten this piece of material, we'd actually have to do a calculation, and it's going to be the same every time for a common rafter. So, a little triangle, like a little wee triangle, yeah. So I'm just going to do it in the middle of the strip. I'll start with 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Set to 12 and 12, that should give me a 45-degree angle. Could I actually determine what this distance is here? I could measure it. My measuring skills aren't too bad. It looks like somewhere between 2 1/8 and 2 3/16. Somewhere in there. But could I actually calculate that as well? So I could go 1.5, 1.5, and figure out what is it? It's not 1 1/16. That's 2 of those. Yeah, our item up there will be 1 1/16, but for this one, this is the full 1.5 by 1.5, and I want to know what the distance between. So it was 2 1/8, so that was good. So if I did a 3/4 by 3/4, that would be the 1 1/16. So if I want to bring this in to a common rafter and a pin rafter that are both 1.5 by 1.5, I only need to look after or worry about half of that. So 1 1/16 would be that diagonal at a 45. Now we're doing all that flat, so we have to measure that in a level plane as well. So I'll go through that together with you here. But that's the start of it there. Okay. All right. So we got through the calculation portion. That's always, as long as you always measure it 90 degrees to a plumb line, it's always going to be the same. And we don't have to figure it out every time. Okay. So for this particular rafter, we're doing a hip rafter. We're going to use 9 for the rise, and we'll use 17 for the run, because it's got to travel a little bit further. So I'll set that up and give you a plumb line here, right off the corner of my rafter. Now technically, zoom is great. Technically that point right there, remember how we were looking at that little setup we had, that small rafter? Where does that theoretical point actually come in? Or we have that image up on the board there as well. That's right up in the middle there, eh? Right up at the center of the ridge board. So somehow I need to remove enough material to get back at the edge of that ridge board, and that's where that 1 1/16 comes in. So I'm going to remove 1 1/16. Actually, that's still technically blue. Shortened. 1 1/16 is half the thickness of the common rafter at a 45-degree angle. Okay? We calculated it here. So we figured 3/4 by 3/4. If we travel at a 45, then that's going to equal 1 1/16. So that's a calculated amount that we've used there. Okay? So I'm going to take that amount off of here to allow for our ridge board or our common rafter and pin in this case, because we're going to use a pin rafter. I'm still back on 9 and 17. Make a new plumb line. That's my shortening amount. Okay, that's now shortened. This was my theoretical. That's my shortened. I set this back up here. That is still something that's happening up on the top corner of that rafter. That should be that point of that cut that we're making with 2 bevels on it. So the next thing I need to do now then is determine, could you grab that little rafter for me, that little hip rafter? So I've done a theoretical, and then I've brought back 1 1/16 for the shortening of the common. What I need the end of it to look like is this. So right now we've got a little wee point established. I need to know where this line is to actually cut it.
So this will be beveled back to this blue line.
Yeah, it's going to, well, not to the blue line, not quite. No, we've allowed for half the thickness of the common and pin at a 45. But I'll show you how to do the rest of it here. That's going to get us to this point, which is essentially the same as kind of a point like this. This one busted off.
Oh, so that highest point on there, that tip is right here.
Yeah,
Oh,
essentially,
okay.
yeah. So now to get our angle, we can measure 3/4 of an inch. Where am I red? There it is. If I measure this way, this material is 1.5 inches, half of that is 3/4. If I measure like this, that's allowing for that cut. Because I'm measuring it all 90 degrees to that plumb line, it's going to allow for that cut. So if I go like that, strike a new line here. Now I've got my shortening, 1 1/16. My side cut is 3/4. And that's all. The side cut is related to the material that I'm using, this hip rafter material. The shortening, in our case, will be related to the pin and the common. Okay. Now I'll just flip this up for a second. And I can actually join that line with that center line that I made. The bottom two lines on our square have side cut, and we just call that a side cut. So we've also got side cut of hip or valley. If I slide over to 9, it gives me a number of 10 5/8. So I can also get that angle without going through that process. I can go 10 5/8 on the body of the square and 12 on the tongue. Should give me that same angle, which is pretty close. It's probably a little bit more accurate than what I did there. Pretty close. So if I want, I can do that this way. 12 on the tongue, 10 5/8 on the body. And I can bring that back to the other face of the rafter. And that gives me that, what we would identify as a double cheek cut. Okay. If we're looking at terms for hip rafters, that would be our double cheek cut, because we've got two cuts.
What did you do here, Trevor, to transfer that line across?
I just connected the middle. That I got that location by squaring this across to the center. So I squared that across, and then I just measured the middle of the rafter. That's where I want it all to line up. And then I just connected this line that I made to that center line. Okay. For this side, I used my side cuts off my square, 10 5/8 and 12, and marked on the 12 side, and that gave me that angle. Both those ways should work.
That was under the 9.
That was directly under the 9, right at the bottom of the table.
You can also square this across too, couldn't you?
I could find, yeah, I could find this location and then just connect them all up.
Like just by squaring this across?
Yep. Yep, that should be 90 degrees across there, yeah. So, lastly, I can put one more cut on here. And I'll just dotted line it. There's two ways to approach cutting this thing. No matter what, I'm going to set a bevel on my circular saw at 45. Because when I go to turn this, when I'm cutting with the circular saw, I am truly cutting at a 45 in line with the plumb cut. So it does work if you set your bevel on your circular saw to 45 for these ones. But I would rather cut right through from this side and then just turn around and nip that one corner off. So I like to have that line up on the top. So it might be easier to see if I show you like this. From your perspective, if I was to cut this with a circular saw, I want to come from this way, and then I'm just going to turn around, keep my saw the same, and just nip off this half that's left. So I like that method, so I can do it all from the same side. But it's up to you. If you wanted, you could just create a plumb line here, which I don't have, but if I had a plumb line there, I could cut from one side and then the other. I just have to flip the rafter over. But that's just my own, maybe my own preference there a little bit. Okay, so that takes care of the top. The top is done. I don't cut that yet. I want to actually hook on with the tape measure on this exact location, because that's where my calculations come from. So if I know a theoretical length of my hip, 48, was it?
Yeah.
I'm going to go down to 48. That's my theoretical length. I'm just going to continue to use the 9 and 17. Sometimes we forget to revert back to 12, but it's going to be all, anything related to this hip, anything that's traveling on a 45 to the wall plate has to be the 17 that we would use. Okay, another tricky part. This whole thing is a little bit tricky, to be honest with you. So, what was our height above plate?
You only marked down.
I took this 48 and I brought it down where I'm going to make my my bird's mouth for the hip. It's a little bigger than the column, so I brought it up fairly high. But I had 2 and 15/16 for a height above plate, right?
Yep.
So I'm going to use the same height above plate for now. Okay. Set this back up 9/17. Grab that little rafter back again for a second. So essentially we're making this cut right here. And I want everything to come in. My common's going to be 2 3/4 up off the wall. And I want my hip to be somewhere in the same plane. Now, the only difference is I don't want this little edge to be in the way. So just like our ridge board, I could leave it like this, and I could take a little bit of this material away, back this off, or I could drop it. And normally, we just drop the hip. We just have to figure out how much. So, I've got a height above plate established here. Yeah, if we're thinking about this, coming over, we can see where it leaves the wall. Right? 3/4 of an inch away is where it's actually going to touch that wall. Well, you can see it on both sides there. There's a gap. So if I measure forward or up the hip 3/4 of an inch, and we're using 3/4 because we're using 1.5 inch material for our hip. If I measure a distance there now, go back to 9 and 17. I'm going to measure that 2 and 15/16 again, but at that line that's shifted forward slightly. So 2 and 15. Set that up again and get my level line or my teeth cut. That is dropped. Okay. If I wanted to back it off, I would stay with this line and I would actually cut that. I would remove this much material from this edge here. So if I